On a cold February morning in 2002, in the quiet farming community of Liberal, Kansas, a 3-year-old boy named Adrian Jones woke up for the last time in his own bed. His mother made breakfast. His father left for work at the grain elevator just after dawn. By noon that day, Adrian had vanished from the family's modest ranch-style home on the edge of town, and the questions that followed would consume investigators, tear apart a family, and leave a community wondering what evil could hide behind drawn curtains and forced smiles. The search would last 6 days. The silence would last 13 years. And when the truth finally emerged, it would reveal something far darker than anyone had imagined possible in their small corner of the heartland. How does a child disappear from his own home in the middle of the day? And why would it take more than a decade for anyone to learn what really happened? The town of Liberal sits in the southwestern corner of Kansas, where the land stretches flat and endless under vast skis that seem to swallow everything beneath them. Population barely 8,000 then. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where unlocked doors were common, and where the biggest employer was the beef processing plant that operated around the clock on the industrial edge of town. The houses spread out in neat grids near downtown, then scattered into rural properties as you drove toward the county roads that cut through wheat fields and pasture land. The Jones family lived at 1847 County Road 12, a single-story home with faded blue siding and a chain-link fence surrounding a yard of patchy grass and bare dirt. Michael Jones, 31, worked the early shift at the cargo grain facility, operating forklifts and managing inventory in the towering silos that dominated the skyline. His wife, Rebecca, 28, stayed home with Adrian and his 5-year-old sister, Emma. To neighbors who waved from their driveways, the Joneses seemed unremarkable. They kept to themselves mostly. The children played in the yard sometimes. Rebecca was seen at the grocery store, at the pharmacy, at the library on Tuesday mornings. But those who knew them better, who had been inside that house, or who had spoken with Rebecca when Michael was not around, sometimes noticed things. The way she flinched when a door slammed. The way the children were always dressed in long sleeves, even in summer. The way Rebecca's laugh seemed hollow, performative, as if she were reading lines from a script she had memorized but never believed. February 14, 2002, began like most winter days in that part of Kansas. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees before sunrise. A thin layer of frost covered the sparse grass and the roof of the family's weathered sedan parked in the gravel driveway. Michael Jones left for work at 5:45 in the morning, just as the first gray light was seeping into the eastern sky. Rebecca was awake. She had made coffee. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old furnace cycling on. According to what Rebecca would later tell investigators, Adrian woke around 7:30. She gave him cereal in the kitchen while Emma watched cartoons in the living room. The morning proceeded normally. Adrian played with toy cars on the linoleum floor. Emma colored with crayons at the dining table. Rebecca did laundry, folding clothes in the small utility room off the kitchen. The television stayed on, filling the house with the bright synthetic voices of animated characters. Just after 11 in the morning, Rebecca said, she put Adrian down for his nap in the bedroom he shared with his sister. She closed the door most of the way, leaving it open just a crack as she always did. She returned to the living room. She sat on the couch. She watched the clock because she needed to start preparing lunch soon, and she wanted to let Adrian sleep at least an hour. At 11:47, her phone rang. It was her sister calling from Wichita, asking about weekend plans. They talked for maybe 20 minutes, Rebecca would later recall. She sat at the kitchen table during the call, facing the window that looked out at the backyard where a rusted swing set stood motionless in the cold air. When the call ended, Rebecca walked down the short hallway to check on Adrian. She pushed open the bedroom door. The twin bed where she had laid him down was empty. The blanket was rumpled. The small pillow still held the impression of his head, but Adrian was gone. Rebecca said she called his name. She checked the bathroom. She checked the closet. She walked through every room of the small house, opening doors, looking under beds, her voice rising with each repetition of his name. Emma looked up from her coloring book, confused. Where was Adrian? Rebecca did not know. She checked the front door, locked from the inside, deadbolt engaged. She checked the back door, also locked. The windows were all closed, latched from the inside. At 12:14, Rebecca Jones called the Seward County Sheriff's Department. Her voice on the recording, which would later be played in courtroom proceedings, sounded strained but controlled. She reported that her son was missing. She said she had put him down for a nap and now she could not find him. The dispatcher asked standard questions. How old was the child? What was he wearing? When did she last see him? Rebecca answered each question. Blue pajamas with trucks on them, just over an hour ago. 3 years old. Brown hair, brown eyes, approximately 35 pounds. Deputies arrived at the house at 12:31. By then, Rebecca was standing in the front yard, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, scanning the empty street as if Adrian might appear at any moment, wandering home from some impossible adventure. The first responding officers were Deputy Clark Hammond and Deputy Lisa Mercado. They entered the house and began a systematic search, opening every door, every cabinet large enough for a small child to hide inside. They checked the crawl space beneath the house, accessible through a panel in the hallway closet. They checked the attic. They found nothing. The house was small enough that the search took less than 15 minutes. Adrian Jones was not inside. Deputy Hammond radioed for additional units. Within an hour, 8 officers were on scene. They expanded the search to the yard, to the neighboring properties, to the drainage ditches that ran along County Road 12. The temperature had climbed to 34 degrees, and the frost was melting into mud. Officers walked the fence line, looked inside the family's storage shed, checked the abandoned barn on the property next door. By 2 in the afternoon, the search had grown to include volunteers from town. Word spread quickly in Liberal. A child was missing. A 3-year-old boy last seen in his own home. People dropped what they were doing. They came in trucks and minivans, in work boots and winter coats. The fire department arrived. The police chief himself drove out from town. Someone brought a search dog, a German shepherd trained in tracking, and the handler let the animal smell Adrian's blanket before releasing it to work. The dog circled the yard twice, nose to the ground, then sat down near the back door and whined. The handler tried again. Same result. The dog showed no interest in tracking beyond the immediate perimeter of the house. Those who were there that first afternoon would later recall the strange stillness that seemed to settle over the scene as the hours passed. The wind died down. The sky remained overcast, a flat gray ceiling that made it impossible to gauge the time by the position of the sun. Volunteers walked in lines across the neighboring fields, calling Adrian's name into the silence. Their voices carried across the empty land and disappeared into nothing. Michael Jones arrived home at 2:45, having been called away from his shift at the grain elevator. He pulled into the driveway and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out, taking in the scene. Police vehicles, volunteers, yellow tape marking off sections of the yard. He walked toward the house with his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Deputies would later note in their reports that Michael seemed unusually calm. He answered questions in a monotone. Yes, Adrian had been fine that morning. No, there had been no arguments. No, he could not think of anywhere the boy might have gone. His responses were brief, factual, delivered without visible emotion. When asked if he wanted to join the search, he nodded and walked out into the field with a group of volunteers, but several people noticed that he did not call Adrian's name. He simply walked, looking at the ground, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Rebecca, by contrast, was frantic. She moved from group to group, asking if anyone had found anything, describing what Adrian had been wearing, pleading for updates. Her hands shook. Her voice broke. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a terrified mother whose child had vanished. The search continued through the night. Portable lights were brought in, flooding the property with harsh white illumination that made long shadows and turned the searchers into strange silhouettes. The temperature dropped into the low 20s. Volunteers rotated out in shifts, going home to warm up before returning. The Red Cross set up a table with coffee and sandwiches. By dawn on February 15th, the search area had expanded to cover 5 square miles. Helicopters from the Kansas Highway Patrol flew grid patterns overhead, their rotors thumping rhythmically above the silent fields. Dive teams checked the stock ponds on surrounding properties, breaking through thin ice to search the murky water below. Nothing was found. Investigators began conducting interviews. They spoke to neighbors, to family members, to anyone who had seen the Joneses in recent weeks. A pattern began to emerge, though it was subtle at first, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. Several neighbors mentioned that they rarely saw Adrian outside. One woman who lived 3 houses down said she had seen Emma playing in the yard many times but could not recall ever seeing Adrian out there. Another neighbor said he had heard crying coming from the Jones house late at night on more than one occasion, though he could not say which child or even if it was a child at all. Rebecca's sister, interviewed by phone from Wichita, said that Rebecca had seemed stressed lately, overwhelmed. She said Rebecca had mentioned that Michael was working long hours and that the children were difficult sometimes, especially Adrian, who Rebecca described as defiant and prone to tantrums. Michael's co-workers at the grain elevator said he was reliable, quiet, kept to himself. One man mentioned that Michael had once said something strange, though he could not remember the exact words. Something about children being more trouble than they were worth. But it might have been a joke. People said things like that sometimes, did they not? On the 3rd day of the search, investigators found the first significant piece of physical evidence, though its significance would not be fully understood until much later. In the crawl space beneath the house, in a corner obscured by old insulation and forgotten storage boxes, a deputy discovered a small section of the concrete floor that appeared newer than the rest. The concrete there was a slightly different color, smoother, less weathered. It covered an area roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. When questioned about it, Michael said he had repaired a crack in the foundation the previous summer. He said water had been seeping in during heavy rains and he had patched it himself, mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow in the backyard. Rebecca confirmed this. Yes, she remembered. It had been in July or August. Michael had worked on it over a weekend. The explanation seemed plausible. The house was old, foundations cracked. People repaired them. Still, investigators made a note of it in their reports. Deputy Hammond took photographs. The concrete was measured and documented. By day 5, the search had begun to wind down. Hundreds of man-hours had been invested. Every ditch within 10 miles had been checked. Every abandoned building, every well and culvert and shed. The fields had been walked and re-walked. Dogs had been brought in from 3 different counties. Nothing had been found. No clothing. No footprints beyond the immediate area of the house. No witnesses who had seen a small boy wandering alone. The community held a vigil on the 6th night. More than 200 people gathered in the high school gymnasium, holding candles and praying for Adrian's safe return. Rebecca attended, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. Michael stood beside her, his expression distant, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. When the pastor asked if Rebecca wanted to say anything, she stepped to the microphone and her voice broke as she pleaded for whoever had taken her son to bring him back. She said she just wanted him home. She said she would not ask questions. She just wanted to hold him again. Those who were there that night said the silence that followed her words was profound. The kind of silence that carries weight, that presses down on you until you can barely breathe. By the end of February 2002, the active search for Adrian Jones had been suspended. The case remained open, classified as a missing person investigation, but there were no new leads to follow. Investigators had interviewed everyone who knew the family. They had searched everywhere a small child could possibly go or be hidden. They had reviewed phone records, financial records, medical records. Nothing pointed to an answer. The prevailing theory, though never officially stated, was that Adrian had somehow left the house without his mother noticing and had wandered away. Perhaps he had fallen into a drainage pipe or an abandoned well that had not yet been discovered. Perhaps an animal had carried him off. Perhaps he would be found in the spring when the snow melted and the fields were plowed. Perhaps he would never be found at all. Rebecca and Michael continued to live at the house on County Road 12, at least for a while. Investigators kept in contact, calling every few weeks to see if anything new had come to light. The answer was always the same. Nothing. No sign of Adrian, no clues, just the terrible absence where a child used to be. Life went on as it does, even after the unthinkable. The volunteers returned to their jobs. The news cameras left town. The yellow tape came down. The Jones family retreated behind their door and their fence and their silence. But for those who had been close to the case, who had walked those fields and searched those ditches and seen the look in Rebecca's eyes, there remained a nagging sense that something was not right. The pieces fit together too neatly. The timeline was too clean. The house too empty, too still, too much like a stage where a performance had been given, and the actors had not yet learned to stop pretending. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves in the months that followed. They talked about the new concrete in the crawl space. They talked about Michael's strange calm. They talked about the search dog that would not track beyond the backyard. But whispers were not evidence. Suspicion was not proof. And without a body, without a witness, without anything concrete to justify further action, the investigation simply stalled. The case went cold. For those who have ever lost someone, who have felt the particular agony of not knowing, the months that followed Adrian's disappearance were a kind of slow torture. Time moved forward, but nothing resolved. The questions remained unanswered. The absence remained unexplained. By the fall of 2002, the Jones family had moved away from Liberal. They relocated to a small town outside Kansas City, starting over in a place where no one knew their story, where they could walk through a grocery store without people staring and whispering behind their hands. Michael found work at a warehouse. Rebecca enrolled Emma in a new school. They rented a small apartment in a complex where the neighbors minded their own business. They did not speak about Adrian, at least not openly. His name became a ghost in their house, present in every silence, in every careful avoidance of the past. Emma, who had been 5 when her brother disappeared, grew quieter over time. She stopped asking when Adrian was coming home. She stopped drawing pictures of him. She learned, as children do, to read the unspoken rules of her family, to understand that certain subjects were forbidden territory. But the silence carried its own weight. It pressed down on all of them, creating a kind of pressure that built slowly over the years. Those who knew the family in that period, neighbors from the apartment complex or coworkers of Michael's, would later say they seemed normal enough. Quiet maybe, private, but not unusual. Plenty of families kept to themselves. Plenty of marriages showed strain. There was nothing that stood out as alarming, nothing that would make someone pick up a phone and call the authorities. Yet there were small moments, small cracks in the facade. A neighbor once heard yelling through the thin walls late at night. Not the words, just the sound of it, angry and sharp. The next morning, she saw Rebecca in the parking lot with sunglasses on, even though the sky was overcast. Emma's third-grade teacher noted in a report that the girl seemed withdrawn, that she rarely smiled, that her drawings often featured dark themes. Shadowy figures, empty rooms, a small boy floating in water. When asked about it, Emma said she did not know why she drew those things. They just came into her head. Michael started drinking more. Not enough to lose his job, but enough that the people around him noticed. He would come home from work and sit in front of the television with a six-pack, drinking until he fell asleep in his chair. Rebecca stopped trying to talk to him about it. She stopped trying to talk to him about much of anything. The marriage, which had never been strong, began to deteriorate in ways that were visible even to strangers. They spoke to each other in clipped sentences. They moved around each other in their small apartment like dancers who had forgotten the steps. At parent-teacher conferences, they sat on opposite sides of the room. When Emma's teacher asked if everything was all right at home, Rebecca smiled and said everything was fine. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the terrible weight of suspicion growing in your chest like a tumor, those years were an education in cognitive dissonance. Emma knew something was wrong. She was too young to name it, too frightened to voice it, but she knew. She had nightmares. In them, she was back in the old house in Liberal. She could hear Adrian crying somewhere, but she could not find him. She would search room after room, opening doors that led to more doors, calling his name into darkness. She would wake up crying, and her mother would come to her bedside and stroke her hair and tell her it was just a dream, that everything was all right, that she should go back to sleep. But Emma noticed things. She noticed that her father never mentioned Adrian's name. She noticed that there were no photographs of him anywhere in the apartment. She noticed that when other children asked if she had siblings, her mother would answer for her quickly, saying, "No, just Emma. We just have Emma." She noticed the way her parents looked at each other sometimes, a look that carried accusation and fear, and something darker that she could not identify. By 2008, 6 years after Adrian's disappearance, Rebecca and Michael were living separate lives under the same roof. He worked. She cleaned houses for money under the table. Emma, now 11, spent as much time as possible away from home, at friends' houses or at the library or anywhere that felt safer than that small apartment with its thin walls and heavy silences. That summer, the breaking point finally came. The details of what happened were never made fully public, but according to court records filed later, there was an incident. Michael came home drunk. There was an argument. Rebecca called the police. When officers arrived, they separated the couple and took statements. In her statement, Rebecca said she wanted a divorce. She said she could not live like this anymore. She said the marriage had been over for years, that they had only stayed together because splitting up felt like admitting something neither of them was ready to admit. Michael was arrested that night for domestic disturbance, though the charges were later dropped when Rebecca declined to press them. But the damage was done. The fragile structure that had held them together finally collapsed. Rebecca filed for divorce in September 2008. She moved out of the apartment with Emma, finding a small house to rent across town. Michael stayed where he was, alone with whatever thoughts occupied his mind during those long nights. The divorce proceedings were contentious. There were arguments about money, about custody, about who was responsible for what. But there was one subject that neither of them raised directly, one name that never appeared in any of the filings. Adrian. It was as if he had never existed, as if acknowledging him would open a door that both Rebecca and Michael desperately needed to keep closed. Emma, caught in the middle of it all, began seeing a school counselor. The counselor's notes, which would later become crucial evidence, documented a gradual process of revelation. At first, Emma talked about the divorce, about missing her father, about being scared. But over time, as trust built, she began to talk about other things. Older things. Things she had been carrying alone for years. She talked about the old house in Liberal. She talked about sounds she remembered hearing that day when Adrian disappeared. She talked about seeing her father's truck in the driveway earlier than it should have been, around noon, when he was supposed to be at work. She talked about being told to stay in her room, about hearing voices, about hearing something heavy being moved. The counselor listened. She took notes. She asked careful questions. And when Emma finally said the words that had been locked inside her for more than 6 years, the counselor knew she had a legal obligation to report what she had heard. In November 2010, 8 years after Adrian Jones vanished from his home in Liberal, Kansas, the Seward County Sheriff's Department received a call from a school counselor in Kansas City. The information she provided was enough to reopen the case. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been a rookie deputy back in 2002 but was now lead investigator in the county's criminal division, reviewed the original case files. She read the reports. She studied the photographs. She looked at the image of that new concrete in the crawl space and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Within a week, a team of investigators traveled to Kansas City to interview Emma Jones, now 14 years old. The interview was conducted in a safe environment, with a trauma specialist present, following all protocols for interviewing minor witnesses in potential criminal cases. Emma told them what she remembered. She told them about seeing her father's truck that day. She told them about being told to stay in her room, about hearing adult voices talking in urgent, angry tones. She told them about the silence that followed. She told them that later, after the police came, her father had told her that if anyone asked, she needed to say she had been watching television all morning and had not seen anything unusual. She told them she had been afraid to say anything before. She told them she thought it was her fault somehow, that she should have done something, said something. She told them she still had nightmares. The investigators listened. They documented everything. And then they made the decision to obtain a search warrant for the property at 1847 County Road 12 in Liberal, Kansas. The current occupants of the house, a retired couple who had purchased it in 2004, were understandably shocked when investigators arrived on a cold morning in December 2010. They were asked to vacate the premises temporarily. They complied, standing in their driveway and watching as crime scene technicians in white suits entered their home carrying equipment. The team went directly to the crawl space. They measured the section of new concrete. They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the surface. The images that came back showed an anomaly. Something was buried there, something roughly the size of a small child. The concrete was broken apart carefully, piece by piece. The dirt beneath was excavated by hand, slowly, methodically. Photographs were taken at every stage. Evidence markers were placed. 3 feet down, they found the remains. Small bones wrapped in plastic sheeting and duct tape. A child's skeleton, positioned in a fetal curl, buried beneath the floor of the house where he had lived. Forensic analysis would later confirm what investigators already knew. The remains were those of Adrian Jones, age 3, missing since February 2002. Cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. The injury was consistent with being struck by a heavy object or thrown against a hard surface with significant force. On December 18, 2010, Michael Jones was arrested at his apartment in Kansas City and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest was made without incident. When officers knocked on his door and identified themselves, Michael opened it and stood there looking at them with that same flat, emotionless expression that deputies had noted 8 years earlier. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He simply held out his wrists for the handcuffs and walked with officers to their vehicle. Rebecca Jones was arrested the same day and charged as an accessory after the fact. She was at work, cleaning a house in a suburb of Kansas City, when officers arrived. She collapsed when they told her why they were there, sinking to her knees on the kitchen floor she had been mopping. The arrests made national news. Headlines across the country told the story of a Kansas boy found buried beneath his own home, of parents who had hidden the truth for nearly 9 years, of a community that had searched in vain while the answer lay beneath the ground they had walked on. The trial took place in the summer of 2012. The prosecution's case was built on Emma's testimony, on the forensic evidence, on the timeline reconstructed from work records and phone logs. The evidence showed that Michael Jones had not been at work the entire morning of February 14, 2002. He had clocked in at 5:45 but had left the facility at 10:30, claiming he needed to go home to retrieve some paperwork. Security footage showed him leaving in his truck. Odometer readings, preserved in maintenance records from that month, showed his vehicle had traveled the exact distance between the grain elevator and County Road 12 and back. Cell phone records showed that Rebecca had called Michael's phone at 10:45 that morning, 17 minutes before she called her sister. The call lasted less than a minute. A forensic psychologist testified about patterns of family violence, about how abuse often escalates, about how perpetrators sometimes recruit family members into silence through fear and manipulation. Emma took the stand. She was 16 years old by then, thin and pale, her voice barely above a whisper. She told the jury what she remembered. She said her father had come home angry that morning. She said she had heard her parents fighting with Adrian, heard her mother screaming at him to be quiet, heard a terrible sound like something heavy hitting the floor, and then silence. She said her father had come to her room later and told her that Adrian was gone, that he had run away, and that if she told anyone what she had heard, bad things would happen. She said she had believed him because she was 5 years old and because she was terrified. She said she was sorry. She said she should have said something sooner. The defense argued that the testimony of a traumatized child, recalling events from more than a decade earlier, was unreliable. They argued that the forensic evidence was inconclusive. They argued that Adrian could have died accidentally, and that the parents, panicked and afraid, had simply made a terrible decision to hide the body rather than face investigation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Michael Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Jones received 15 years for her role in concealing the crime. Both were taken into custody immediately. Emma Jones, who had carried the weight of that day for most of her life, was placed in the care of relatives. She declined to speak to the media. Her victim impact statement, read by the prosecutor, was brief. She said she hoped her brother could finally rest. She said she hoped she could finally stop having the nightmares. The case of Adrian Jones became a touchstone in Kansas and beyond for discussions about family violence, about the failures of systems meant to protect children, about the terrible silence that can hide in plain sight behind closed doors and forced smiles. Training protocols for law enforcement were updated. Social workers studied the case file to understand what signs might have been missed. But for those who had been there that February day in 2002, who had walked those fields calling a name that would never be answered, the resolution brought no satisfaction. Only a terrible, heavy sadness for a small boy who had deserved so much more than the 3 short years he was given. Adrian Jones is buried now in the Liberal Cemetery, under a stone that bears his name, his dates, and a single line: "Gone too soon, never forgotten." On the anniversary of his disappearance, people still leave toys at the grave. Small trucks like the ones he played with on the kitchen floor that last morning. The swing set from the old house was removed years ago, sold for scrap, but some mornings when the wind blows across those empty fields, you can almost hear the sound of chains creaking, the phantom echo of a child's laughter. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.